Okay, fantastic. We're going to put a pause in this discussion for a moment, maybe come back to it later. Now I'd like to shift to a couple of questions with Charlie Beckett. For those who don't know, Charlie is a professor at the London School of Economics. He is leading the Journalism AI initiative at Polis. And he's the lead on the Journalism AI report, which I think we have shared in the Telegram chat, which I really highly recommend. It's sort of one of the most comprehensive looks at the situation of AI in journalism, looking at over 70 news organizations from 32 countries. And it's frankly a really great lead. Thank you so much, Charlie, for joining us. So maybe just to kick off the conversation, I wanted to ask, a few years ago, it feels like there was a fair share of pessimism about AI and journalism, that, look, we lost the plot on the first sort of technological innovation that was the internet. We were behind the curve consistently. And, now there's this next generation of an innovation, AI. We don't have the resources. We can't keep up. I think I even remember you reading that, you writing in one of the articles that, if we value journalism as a social good, we basically have a window of 2 to 5 years. Otherwise, the game is over. Looking at the past year and how, COVID has accelerated a lot, how the industry has changed, are we getting closer or moving further away?
I think we're getting much closer. I mean, my perspective is very sort of, global, in the sense that I look internationally, and obviously there are parts of the world which are not as advanced as other parts of the world. I also look at it globally in the sense of looking at so many different types of media organizations. We've got more diversity of business models and news organizations than we've ever had before. So they are all going to approach this technology in different ways. But I mean, in a way, our project has been about trying to bridge the gap. It's been trying to, introduce news organizations to the idea of these AI technologies. And what we've been doing in the last year is, for example, creating free online courses for journalists to kind of introduce them to the idea of AI and the idea of having an AI strategy. And I was amazed. I mean, they're free, but we've had tens of thousands of people viewing these things. And I think that's a real sign there's an appetite, at least, to find out more. We also ran a fantastic collab challenge where we got 5 different teams of journalists from different news organizations working together on particular challenges, some of them very similar to the challenges that the colleague on tonight's event have been talking about. Everything from content recommendation, summarization, even looking at the idea of how do you mitigate bias within newsrooms. So I think there's so much going on, and it's so very different. And as has been alluded to, this is a different kind of technology. So it's harder to get across it, in the sense that there are so many different types of AI, machine learning, automation. There are so many different uses within your organization. It can be for marketing or it can be for news gathering, that, to be honest, a lot of, if you like, kind of traditional or mainstream news organizations look at it and are very confused. It's sort of more confusing than that big shift online that happened 20 years ago. That was a big leap. Then there was social media, and in a sense that was intuitive. You could kind of eventually work out how Facebook worked. But I think with the AI technologies, it requires a lot more collaboration, frankly. And again, one of the big surprises for me has been how news organizations have been prepared to think outside of their normal, very competitive mentality. But of course, it takes time. We've just had a massive pandemic. There are all sorts of problems, especially for the news industry, because the news industry is actually quite small. Pharmaceuticals is big, and often pharmaceuticals, for example, or retail or security, they can operate at a scale we wouldn't even imagine. And I think for the news industry, especially because it's so fractured into different little sectors, different markets, it's harder to do that R&D. That's why it's so important that you've got people like Claire, you know, working in an academic environment. Also people like, you know, Shane and Ben, who are not declared journalists. They're tech people who have got a solution which probably would work in other fields as well, but could work in journalism. So there's a whole new ecosystem out there. And I think, yes, it's very much a transitional phase. There's still a real danger of the journalists getting behind on this. But certainly there's been remarkable progress forward. Just one last thing. It really is important that the journalists get across this, because there is no point coming up with brilliant tools if it doesn't augment, if it doesn't support the real value of news organizations. If all this is just tech, then frankly, tech companies will do it much better than news media companies.
Thank you. So a lot of really fascinating things to pick up. One thing that I would like to just start with now is you mentioned that, so our industry is small and it is extremely fractured, right? There's a lot of concern about now, oh my goodness, New York Times has so many subscribers, it's going to eat everybody. You know, 4.5% of journalists in the US work for the New York Times. That seems incredibly big for us, but obviously if you look at any other industry, that's still one of the most fragmented that exist. Is it possible for sort of news publishers to really benefit the benefits of AI and actually sort of cross over this gap without significant market consolidation?
No, I think one thing you have to be realistic about is that AI technology is not the only thing happening in news media. There are kind of other big trends that are driving things like consolidation. They're also providing opportunities. So we have this whole sort of passion economy, niche journalism, Substack, the newsletter journalism that could only survive because of these kind of technologies. So they're enabling as well as accelerating other trends. So AI isn't going to completely transform journalism. All it can do is help you head in the direction perhaps that you were headed anyway. So if you're Bloomberg, you are going to have a fantastic large-scale automation of company reports, which are done very, very quickly, because that is absolutely what adds value to your customers. On the other hand, if you are somebody who has you're one person doing a newsletter on Substack or something, then the little bit you want is the AI or machine learning technology, which allows you to personalize that newsletter or to understand the audience data that you're getting back in real time. So it's going to be obviously different, horses for courses, but I think different technologies will not work universally. And I think there's one thing that's been alluded to before is it is all about the implementation. And if you talk to people in other industries, that's the same thing. You can come up with a great marketing tool, you go to a retail chain, but they will have special requirements. They will have a particular mission, a particular consumer base, a particular product. And the same thing applies to journalism, that I think the key bit is having the people in the organization who understand the technology and can implement it and then monitor it and iterate it and review it. They don't have to know all the code. You bring in people perhaps to do that. You have to understand, I think Claire referred to this earlier, how is it going to impact on your workflows? As I say, whether you're a one-person niche passion economy journalist or whether you're Bloomberg or the New York Times with thousands of people.
So I think there's this really interesting thing of basically, these need to be tools that work for the journalist, right? Like whether it's in Bloomberg, whether we're talking about the Substack writer, essentially this idea that, look, we're trying to find ways to sort of augment your capabilities. At the same time, I find that you know, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but our industry has bled talent. And one of the reasons it has bled talent is because there's no profits, right? And so, you know, if you can't pay people only sort of enough, then only the really passionate or you know, eccentric will stay on with you. And then the rest will sort of go and find other ways to feed their families. You know, if we can make the business models more efficient, then obviously that also sort of changes the equation. That said, you know, looking at, for example, your survey, 2/3 of the media said that they're primarily looking at AI as a way of making journalists more efficient. Are we missing the bigger picture of, you know, whether it's working on subscriptions, you know, clustering subscribers, the you know, marketing, augmenting, like all of the other functions of a business, except for the content?
Well, I think I would probably argue that of all the different areas of journalism where AI can make certainly a business difference, it's got to be in the revenue and audience engagement. Now, if you are, for example, a clickbaity, sensationalist, crappy news organization, you may just want to use AI to accelerate that clickbait. Good luck to you, that'd be fine. But for those people who are trying to sell journalism, then there's no point. You've got to think hard about what you're using the algorithms to achieve. Firstly, it will be to create better journalism. Instead of writing lots of copy that everyone else is writing, you might want to use a tool like Loyal AI have developed so you can differentiate your product. You can make sure it's more relevant to your particular audience. And hopefully it can free up time. I mean, you know, I started in a local newspaper many years ago, and I remember typing in football results into, you know, on a typewriter that was then printed off. Now, that was a complete waste of my fabulous creative talents, my investigative zeal. You know, I should have been unleashed on creating something that would have added value and made more of an impact. So it's all part of the business case, I think, around these technologies. It's to augment, you know, for example, you know, the fantastic investigative Panama Papers operation, which was highly collaborative, could not have been done without this technology that enabled them to search through those databases. It just wouldn't have happened. But then it was the judgment of the journalists who were able to, you know, pick out which data was the most story worthy, and then to create narratives around them that people would read. So I think it's a, you know, if you like, it's a kind of holistic process. You can't just expect the AI. You can't bolt it in and watch your profits rise. It's a whole piece, and it's about paying attention. You mentioned, you know, the loss of talent. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems we've got here. If you're a kind of data scientist or a product developer, who are you going to work for? Are you going to nip down the road and work for Google on some six-figure salary? What would tempt you to come and work for a news organization? Well, it's quite interesting, you know, many are, and it's partly about the mission and the creativity, but you've got to make them welcome. You've got to give them the freedom to innovate and develop products, and you've also got to show attention. So if you're a hard-boiled journalist, an editor or a manager, you also have a responsibility to become more literate about this technology so that you can build the relationships with these people who have got the talent to create these tools. They may operate outside, like Loyal AI. They may be kind of, you know, startups or intermediaries, or they may be within. And as I say, the project we did last year, and we're repeating it again this year with another set of people, where people were collaborating with other news orgs and with other organizations, was really, that I think is the way forward. Just one last point. What's really interesting is we are starting to see different career paths. I was fascinated by the people who took part in our project, because so many of them had a very sort of hybrid career path. They may have started as hacks, and then they went out and did some tech work, or they may have been data scientists who just found that, you know, the journalism field was so interesting that they wanted to be part of that. And because, you know, journalism, at least at its best, has a kind of public value, a public mission. And you can be a data scientist and have ethics, you know,